coming back to Saratoga Springs, where I grew up, is also filled with a lot of memories of the journalism that I kind of learned how to do. Tom and I worked together at the Saratogian, and that's now a pizza place and coffee shop, which is great if you like pizza and coffee. It's a little sad if you remember the time when the newsroom was 5 steps from City Hall and the police station.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, I take part in a conversation on the state of the media. Well, recently I had the great honor to take part in a media panel held at Saratoga Springs Public Library, where I started my journalism career laying out the high school newspaper more than 2 decades ago. My fellow panelists were Thomas Dimopoulos from Saratoga TODAY, Will Pedigo from WMHT, Miles Reed of the Daily Gazette, Tom Eschen from WRGB CBS 6, and Anya Tucker from WTEN ABC News 10. The point of the conversation was to discuss how news gathering works and the state of the industry. And as with any good panel, I learned a little myself. Okay, here's our conversation.
I am going to let them introduce themselves and also say the media place that they are from. And they're going to talk today about how they gather the news and relay the facts to the community. And I'm sure that their processes are just a little bit different. So that would be really nice to hear about. And they will each talk about 5 or 10 minutes about their process. And if it goes a little bit longer, I'll just give them a high sign because we only have a certain amount of time that we are going to be here today. And I thought it would be nice to get some of the questions that we have. And so without further ado, I think we will start with Anya. And we'll just move it like this and it should be just fine. Okay, thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Anya Tucker, and I'm a reporter with News 10 ABC. I've been with the station for about 17 years now. It's really flown by. I'm originally from Michigan, the Detroit area. I initially did not do this. I got my degree in education, but I found my true love in storytelling and I started at a station in Detroit and made my way to the Albany area. I'm married. I have 2 young boys, and I'm happy to be living in the capital region and to call this place my home.
Good morning, it's Miles Reed at the Daily Gazette. So I'm the editor of the Gazette. Some of you in the crowd, I think, probably remember the paper as the Schenectady Gazette. For the last 30 years, we've been Daily Gazette. In the last couple of years, we've expanded our coverage area in the capital region. For over 125 years, we've covered mainly, the Schenectady-based center of the region. In the last 3 years, we've added 2 other newspapers in the Mohawk Valley, daily newspapers. We operate those at the newspaper along with the Gazette. So it's the same crew, sort of expanded out a little bit. We face the same kind of challenges that I think local news does all across the country. I think we're super lucky in the capital region that we don't have the kind of news deserts. I think some of you here, probably because you're here, you hear about this idea, this concept, phenomenon of these news deserts, communities where just local news just does not exist. It's a crisis without a doubt. The capital region, I think, is super lucky right now. We do have local newspapers, as many of you know, who have been really gutted a lot. They still continue to duke it out. The Gazette staff is nothing what it used to be. When I first started, when I was first the city editor, I had a staff of roughly 28 reporters, and we're down now to about 12, 13 reporters, which actually is a really healthy reporting staff for local news. So there is no doubt that there is a huge gutting. I think one of the biggest causes, and this is not news to anybody who's paying attention, is how the news media can sort of capitalize on this whole digital age. So many people are on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn, and this common refrain that, oh, I don't need to subscribe to the local newspaper to get my news online. I try to talk to people about that and say, well, there's got to be some skilled, trained, edited reporting staff out there collecting that news, synthesizing it, not getting spun, trying to teach, trying to present a balanced story. So this trend is certainly daunting. The idea that you get your news online, they're still at the other end of that, really a big effort. It takes a lot of money, time, and expertise to tell those stories. So that's the $1 trillion question. The Gazette has, we've benefited from independent ownership. So we don't have some parent company off in a far off city that expects these huge returns in terms of profit. And a lot of news groups do. There's this conglomerating of news groups around the country that keep buying up these local papers, basically stripping out the staff, sucking out all the profits. So the news coverage just deteriorates. So we're fortunate. It is a battle every day to keep staff. It's a battle every day to cover as much as we want to. We used to, I think the telling anecdote, when I first started at the Saratogian, we had, I think, 11, 12 reporters in the newsroom. And at the time, the Gazette, which was the big kid on the block, along with the Times Union, and also the Nick News, but that eventually left. The Gazette at the time had reporters. So we had 3 reporters in Saratoga Springs. We had 2 in Ballston Spa, 2 in Mechanicville, 2 in Clifton Park, Half Moon. And then, of course, there were a whole crew back at the main office in Schenectady that were regional, so that they would sort of push into Saratoga County when they needed to. So now at the Gazette, we have 1 reporter who covers all of Saratoga County. We do push in reporters to help and assist with that coverage in terms of crime, education, sports, etc. But really 1 reporter to deal with it. So when somebody in their community calls me and says, why don't you do a story about this application before the planning board, etc., we just have to really pick and choose what can we do. And Saratoga Springs, the city council these days sort of sucks up a lot of oxygen in the room. So we have to decide how much are we going to do that. I think we probably, we try our best. The TU does a lot with it. WAMC does a fair bit, but it is a massive challenge. So thank you for paying attention to local media, and hopefully people will go online and subscribe to us, to any of the groups here, donate whatever it takes.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to this great panel, some of whom I worked with in years past, and others whose work is just so great. My name is Pickus. I'm the news director at WAMC Public Radio, and I was so thrilled to be asked to be part of this today. I'm from Saratoga Springs, and my journalism career began upstairs 1 floor, where I used to sign out a computer for as many hours as they would let me on the weekend to do the layout for my high school newspaper in Saratoga. And that was the first journalism gig I ever had. It's funny because it's been so long that I learned a skill that's now a little obsolete doing it, but it was a great place to start out. And coming back to Saratoga Springs, where I grew up, is also filled with a lot of memories of the journalism that I kind of learned how to do. Tom and I worked together at the Saratogian, and that's now a pizza place and coffee shop, which is great. If you like pizza and coffee, it's a little sad if you remember the time when the newsroom was 5 steps from City Hall and the police station. Today, I'm the news director at WAMC. I started working there the day after Christmas in 2008, mainly out of broke desperation, trying to catch on somewhere. And my first job there was 5 to 9 a.m. on weekdays, $10 an hour. So that's how journalism was then, and I think in a lot of ways it is today. People are in it because they care, and that's the main reason. In my job as a news director, I oversee a staff covering daily news. We've got a bureau at Skidmore College. We've got a bureau in our main office in Albany, Springfield, Massachusetts, Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Plattsburgh, New York, and in Poughkeepsie. And we try to fill in all the blanks between those geographic locales, doing daily news. The analogy that I like to use when I'm especially talking to interns is we build a sandcastle every day. It's the most elaborate, beautiful sandcastle you've ever seen. And then the tide comes in and we start over the next day. And that's the challenge for daily news. It's to try to get ahead as best you can, but also be responsive to whatever the breaking story is. And as Miles says, a lot of times it's triage, knowing that you really won't be able to get to everything that you want to. So how do you best use the limited resources to make sure that the listeners are getting the top story each day? And we're on 365 days a year. The newsroom never closes. We do an hour midday news broadcast every single day of the year, which is a tremendous amount of pressure, but also a great gift because we get to try again the next day to make it better. And that's the way that I was sort of brought up at the station after starting out at the Saratogian, is that daily news it wears you down, but it's also a free chance every day to kind of improve on the day before. And that's something I like about it now that I have slightly better hours.
What time do you wake up, by the way?
Oh, well, when I started, I could tell you the first 2 years, the alarm went off at 3:52.
Slightly better.
But now things have worked, now I'm more showing up at about 7:15 ready to go.
Hi, everybody. I am very grateful. Thanks, Renee, for inviting us here for this conversation. We don't always get an opportunity to reflect on the work that we do, but everybody here is super passionate about it. So thank you for this opportunity to share the work of journalism in our communities. I'm Will Pedigo. I'm the Chief Content Engagement Officer with WMHT, the PBS member station for the Capital Region. Our news program is New York Now, which is a weekly statewide show, and it operates out of the LCA, in the State Capitol Building, the Legislative Correspondence Association, which is older than the White House Press Corps. It's been there more than 100 years, which is pretty cool. And if you walk in it, it feels like a movie set. We're trying to figure out what are those stories that are going to help our audiences understand both how their government works and their role in it, and what's happening that's going to affect your lives on a day-to-day basis. I have tremendous respect for Dan Clark and Alexis Young, our reporters and hosts that just have an incredible deep knowledge of who the people are, what's happening. I'm always asking Dan, okay, what's going to happen with this bill, or who's going to win this election, and usually he knows what's going to happen, which is pretty fascinating. We are in a transformational period in our industry, no denying it. I got into public media at Nashville Public Television in 2003, where I worked almost 18 years. And when I came in, it was all about going from analog to digital. And then we had the financial crisis, and then and it's just continues to evolve and change. And so I think everything we have to do is to embrace the fact that everything changes all the time. You just got to run with it, and you got to figure out how to meet your audiences where they are. We're looking, very carefully at our broadcast numbers, which have now dipped below. Broadcast and cable numbers have dipped below streaming numbers for the first time. That happened this past summer, and that trend will never go the other direction. The digital is just going to be the way people access our content, and we have to meet people where they are. I know that 1% of our audience for New York Now is 18 to 34, and those folks, no matter how much we try to cajole them, they're not going to meet us at broadcast. They're not going to be there. We are going to have to find them and provide them the content they need on our variety of streaming platforms. That's a good opportunity to plug our New York Now newsletter, which is relatively new, at nynow.org. If you want to subscribe, please do. We have to think about how we meet people on platforms that we no longer control, right? Like broadcasters, we've had a bully pulpit for a long time where we've been able to reach folks universally. And now we know that our audiences are in a variety of places on playgrounds where we don't get to make the rules. and we have to figure out how to navigate that. I look at this past December, we did a 30-minute episode about New York's cannabis industry and what was going to happen and what the plans were, how New York's approach to it. We put up clips on TikTok and they were censored because of the word cannabis. So, what do you do there? So there are things that we can't control, and then there are things that, well, we don't have the resources to compete with YouTube in the same way. So it's just a constant strategy of priorities and strategic planning and hard work and passion about the role that we play in our communities, the mission of the work that we do that does not change, and how we can continue to provide the content that we all need to be able to be active and engaged citizens in our community. Oh, sorry.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Tom Eschen. I'm the weekend anchor at CBS 6 News. I've been there since September now, so I've been there a relatively short time. It's actually the fourth different stop I've made in my own career. And obviously being in a capital and in this area of the country has been a thrill for me, and all these colleagues up here, it's really cool to hear their stories and to read and watch and everything that they've done throughout their careers. Is, when you go to a new place, you try to do all of that in this business, and that's been a really cool aspect. So like I said, I've seen, I guess, a little bit of both ends. I worked in the last few years on the digital side of things, more so than anything else. I've made stops in local news in my career. I've done sports, I've done news, I've worked in assignment desks. So it's been really interesting over the course of my now 11 years to see how much things have changed. And I think across the mediums here, you're hearing kind of some of the same themes of some of those new entities. And I think a lot of us thought that technology maybe would only help, these different parts of the news business, when it comes to radio, print or TV, and that would enhance it. It's really caused some more challenges, I think, than anything else with, of course, social media. And then you have some different places that are very specific in some of those niches that are making it more difficult for somebody maybe like me, who I'm out there every day. I report 3 days a week. I'm in the studio on Saturdays and Sundays anchoring. But when you have somebody that might have a very specific beat, you're competing with that and trying to have the same sources and trying to have the same people you're talking to. And so that's been part of the advent of the blog, I guess you could call back in 10 years ago. And some of these different followings on social media, YouTube pages, things like that, which I've seen across the grid, both in the news side of things and also the sports side of things as well. And I think that's been really interesting. I remember I was in a locker room, 7, 8 years ago, and here I am, I've probably been in the business 4 or 5 years, and I had a journalism degree, went to Ithaca College, did everything I was supposed to do, and all of that. And I'm standing next to a 21-year-old kid who's got a phone on this little pedestal there and worked for a blog. And we were, on the same level. And I was like, well, things are changing. And that's when you can see the people that were asking the questions are changing as well. And I think the motivation is probably all the same. I mean, I think in some aspects you have some of those more niche places when it comes to the digital aspect of those sides, where they might be working for a team, when it comes to the sports side, or they're working for, a part of the government where they're, there just to film it or ask those questions that are going to be the right way. And we are sort of that individual entity that kind of stands on its own. So I think there's still an advantage of that. And that's what really motivated me to get back on the news side of the equation, as I've been in the sports world and the digital thing more so in the last couple of years, because you can really see the need, I think, at this point for people that are going to go in there, ask tough questions, and hold a lot of these people accountable. And I think that that's really important in this day and age when you have a lot of things that are said more so than ever. We know more than we ever have in our lives, right? Because we're so aware. You hear all the time people say, oh, things feel like they're so bad these days or whatever. And I've read some books where they're like, well, we just know more than we ever have about anything. So at the end of the day, it's sort of trying to weed out a lot of that information on a daily basis and trying to find the truth. And, you know, some of the questions that I think that people have asked are where do you find that? How do you know? And it takes work. You know, it's not easy at times. And I think that that's part of the stresses that I think a lot of us feel. We talk about the daily news cycle. And back in the day, I mean, I've worked with people that have been in the business for 30, 40 years that had their own producer. They had their own photographer on a daily basis. They would work on stories over the course of weeks, if not months, to make these investigations happen. And that still happens. There are still people that do that. But at the end of his career, his name was Jim Kenyon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He worked in Syracuse, New York with me. I was starting my career. He was ending his. He was out there doing the same thing, the day of stories, in addition to some of the other things he was working on. So even the people that have done it for so long are expected to still do that at the end of the day. And I think you have that pressure with these resources that are more limited in this day and age that makes it a little bit more of a challenge. Not that the work isn't still being done, and not that people aren't out there giving their all every single day, but it does make it tougher to get some of those great stories that I think you see. And I think we're all trying to still tell those at the end of the day at the same time. So it's a delicate balance in this day and age. And I will say about the Capital Region, and we talk about this market in particular, the engagement that I have felt even in the first 6-7 months of being here from the audience, from the viewers, is up there. And I think people are invested in what's going on around here. And I think that's helped even invigorate me more to be able to help share some of those stories. That's what I love to do at the end of the day. And I think that's really important. So, you know, doing, I guess, a little bit of everything is important for people these days, and reporters, and that's where some of the stresses also lie. But I think everybody's heart they're in this business is in the right place. And I've seen people leave the business that are around my age. I look around the newsroom, it's a lot of people that are a lot younger than me and some people that are a lot older than me. I think personally, I'm in a spot that's kind of in the middle where I've seen a lot of people my age make that decision at this point. Am I going to go to a PR side? Am I going to go work for the state or something like that? So I think you find a whole different type of person now that is in the business, depending on where you go. And I think you're seeing that probably across the board. So thank you again for coming today. I appreciate it. And obviously we'll probably answer some questions later, and some of those questions that have been asked. So just want to say thank you once again, and looking forward to speaking with you further.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. I'm Thomas Dimopoulos. I currently work at Saratoga Today newspaper. It's a weekly. It covers Saratoga Springs and surrounding communities. I first began here when I first moved here in the late 90s. I began as a stringer for the Times Union and writing for Metroland, if anybody remembers that, the Arts Weekly. Worked at the Saratogian when it was indeed a filled newsroom in the world before Facebook, before friending was a verb. Also worked at the Post-Star, ran the Saratoga Bureau when it was located in the Collimer building here. And when Miles spoke, he reminded me of a time when Saratogian was active. Some of the news stations, I think News 13 was in town. Post-Star had a bureau of the Collimer building. Times Union and the Gazette had offices in the Arcade building, I think it was. Exactly. And you had other media around as well. And we'd all run out chasing for the same story, chasing for a different angle. But as I said today, I work for a weekly, where in the past I worked for a daily, so it's a little bit different. The rhythm is different. It's not better or worse. It's just an adjustment as to how that news gets out there. Social media has changed the world in a lot of ways. Not just, I think, for the news industry, but also for many fields. see musicians now who can do their work and get their work out to the public and are not reliant on 3 or 4 companies signing them the labels. Photographers can share, artists of all kinds can share their art with the world. And in the news media, we can write our stories, we can tweet immediately and provide all kinds of information that goes out there. Of course, the other side of that is maybe 2 things. One is the quality of the work that's getting out there, based on technology has gotten so much better. You can go around with an iPhone and take a real nice picture of a street scene. But the photographer who's been doing it, who's been trained on it, will know how to set that picture with the landscape behind it. Will surround it with different things. Will give you an idea of the meaning of that particular second that that image was captured. So we can translate this to many different fields, as I said. So the technology, again, like all things, like most things, is it good or not so good? For me, I think what I continue to try to stay true to is the original ideal that I learned in journalism many years ago. And it was, I'm paraphrasing, but it was Pete Hamill, who's a great columnist and journalist for many years, had said, what he said is our job is to go back into the cave, back into the darkest corner of the cave, to meet and to speak with the elders, and then to come back out and to share that story with the tribe. And I think at the heart of it, with many changes, that approach will best do honor to people who are reading our stories, listening to our stories, watching our stories, and taking the information.
Thank you all for sharing all of your information about the news. And I have some questions for you. It's up to you who would like to answer. If all of you would like to answer, it's totally up to you. So the first question I have is, how do you proceed when the story is breaking and you want to be that first reporter to get all of the facts and share with the public? What do you do?
Get there first. Before the police, security signals.
I think this goes back to what you were saying about when people say, how do you get this information anyways? Do you just make this stuff up? And the answer is no, definitely not. You go to your sources, basically. If there's a breaking news situation, and I'm not sure how, everybody has their own way of doing it, but for me, it's always been contacts. Like, I can rely on people who I have established relationships with through work. You know, my beat for many, many years was crime. So breaking news, that's a good beat to have. And I could rely on a lot of law enforcement sources, anyone in the area. There's been times when I've even called like a Stop and Shop or a Stewart's store and asked, hey, I hear something's going on in your area. Can you tell me what's going on? Can you tell me while I'm racing out there with my photographer next to me? And by the way, when I say my photographer, it's not a diminished kind of a thing. I mean, like the people that I rely on the most, we are a real team. And making those phone calls and pounding the phone and calling as many people as you can before you even get to the scene to see what the heck's going on. And that's when you're able to confirm some of the information that you hear or what you see on the scene. There's a good rule of threes in news. A lot of us have heard of this before. If you can get 3 separate sources confirming the same thing, then you can pretty much feel comfortable going with that information. It's very difficult when you only have one source. A lot of times I rely on those sources, and people who watch my stories will know that a lot of them are source-based. They are not people who are willing to go on camera, yet I need to prove to my news director, and I need to be able to say with 100% at least, you know, certainty that these are solid sources and I can go with that information, and that will enhance my story and help me tell a better story, because now I have the facts and I have those in my back pocket. I hope that makes some sense to me.
I just wanted to add just a little bit, just to expound on, I think, what Anya's saying. And it's an important part that we have at the paper in terms of when we're gathering breaking news and we're trying to get it out there. There's a huge rush and competition to get it first. And that creates sort of this tremendous pressure for the reporters, especially, I think, newer ones in the market and the younger ones. So because the region is blessed with a whole bunch of TV stations and radio stations and print reporters, there's this huge rush. One of the jobs that I do is make it absolutely clear, and Anya comes in as a reporter, and she's got really good sources. So for her news director, that is a confidence and a comfort level, so they can trust the senior reporter who's developed those sources. The flip side is a lot of news agencies now are staffed by a lot of younger, inexperienced people who just haven't had the time to develop the sources. So in those cases, it's super critical in the newsrooms to vet those scoops, vet the news. And so especially one of the things I talk about with newer reporters is things aren't always what you think they are. You can look at something and you have to actually apply sort of a close scrutiny to make sure you got it. And I apply that not just to the reporter, but I ask them to talk to me about who the source was, because the same thing extends to the source. Somebody might say, I know for sure that something happened because I was talking to my wife and she was at the train track and she saw that person get run over. So we just try our best to get that story out there, but really make it super critical that we vet those things, especially if it's a story that in any way involves loved ones, there's a death, or there's a massive arrest of somebody on bank fraud, whatever it is. So it's this dual pressure to get it as quickly as we can, beat the competition, but absolutely get it right, because that's something it's hard to unring that bell if you make an error, especially if it's a story that involves a tragedy that somebody lost a life or something.
Yeah, we just have a rule that we'd rather be second and right than first and wrong. And there's an old joke about public radio that we'll give you the news on the second day and call it analysis. And we're constantly striving against that thinking because we want to be competitive with everybody. But it's just what Miles is saying. There are a lot of people who have an axe to grind, and really you gotta build up sources that you can trust and that they can trust you. And it's all relationships. Covering Saratoga Springs, my colleague Lucas Willard has been knocking his head around in city politics here for a dozen years, and it has taken, in some cases, that long to get people to trust us or to call us first. And you can't replicate that on day one. And a lot of times, at places like ours, you have people who are just starting out. They're fresh out of college. They haven't lived in this area before, and it takes a long time to build that up. And one thing that comes to mind, I'm not going to name names, but one of our colleagues in the Capital Region, I remember, reported not long ago on a former Saratoga Springs City Councilor's death, and it was not correct. And just what Miles is saying, you cannot unring that bell. I mean, if you're going to go on Twitter, which is instantaneous, and say such and such person has died and they are still alive, that is one for the wall of shame, I think. And that haunts people like us. We never want to be in that position where we've gotten something like that wrong. And for me, I'd rather take the loss. If there's any question at all, I'd rather be second and right.
And you know, I think maybe a slightly different angle on it. Like I was working on a piece about sort of the contemporary LCA, Legislative Correspondence Association of the Capitol, and one of the things that, in talking to the reporters that work there, is that while yes, the business is cutthroat, and yes, your deliverables are many and frequent, and it's a tremendous source of stress, there's also a lot of camaraderie. There's a lot of information sharing that happens. There's a lot of, hey, I heard this press release is, you know, or this rally is happening. So-and-so has said they're going to, you know, give some comments at 1 o'clock. And, you know, the pandemic shifted a lot of things. There's more access to maybe seeing the Assembly or the Senate sessions online. But the value of being there and doing the work is that then you can be watching, you can be writing your story, you can be, you know, analyzing what they're saying, and you can pound that door. And as soon as people come out, be there to ask those questions. And what's this going to cost? And how is this going to affect people? And are you, you know, for this or against it? Why does it matter? And so, you know, that sense of just being there, doing the work, you know, the stories will come. And then the other thing is, I mean, you know, we're in that same, you know, reflection and analysis on a weekly show. And so then it really is like, what is the bigger context of how is this going to impact people's lives, and understanding the role of media and understanding the role of government and all of that.
I'll speak from the new to the area perspective here when it comes to all that. And some of that anxiety that comes, not just talking about running with something where you have one source characterized. So that, you know, that's why, you know, I think you have a newsroom, especially if you're somebody that's newer and you don't have as many people or whatever built up in that. You might know the area, you might have some contacts, and that's great. But for me, I rely on the people in my newsroom that have been here for a while. And I think that really makes a huge difference when I can say, well, I got this, you know, what have you heard, or what, a thing like that, before you go and run with something. And the other aspect as well that I can touch on is when it's not necessarily like a crime scene or a fire, or just a story that you're going to break. It's important, especially if there's one or two people coming to you with it, is what is their agenda, and asking, why are they telling me this? What did they have to gain from that? Which I think can also impact how far you go with it and where you go, where the next step is. So I think that's another aspect when you're trying to break a story, is saying, well, why are they telling you this at the end of the day? Instead of just saying, okay, there's some information, but you have to know that there's a motivation for them to share it with you at the end of the day. That sometimes they might just like you. Sometimes usually that's not the case.
I would mostly agree and just reiterate what others have said, which is sourcing people who are intimately aware, whether it's people in the police department or the fire department in tragedies, town council people, there are situations going on there. That's important. Also, to your point, realizing, and Ian also made the point, realizing people may have an agenda, an axe to grind. So again, multiple sources. When you do spend time in the community, you will create trust with folks, and they will know that basically all you want to do is get the information, get the truth, and then share it with everybody.
So what do you do if you cannot get all sides of the story?
I would say that we, getting all sides of the story is super important. It's critical, but it's only kind of absolutely necessary. I think in one sort of area of reporting, the stories, political stories. There are a lot of stories that, I know that it sounds odd, but where if you have a perfect source, we call them a perfect source. If they're the chief of police, and it's a story about some kind of a budgetary issue, it's not necessarily important to have another side of it. We might have it, but I mention it because there is a whole lot of stuff that we do in covering the communities that doesn't always involve like a second side of it. And I'm not trying to go off the subject of this question, but with the political stories, it's absolutely important. Or if there, is some kind of a lawsuit involving, business partners and there's a falling out and somebody sues the other side, that's super important. But I just think it's, there is a part of our community reporting where we can do plenty of stories without necessarily hunting down another side. So again, I'm not trying to go off the subject, but there is a whole bunch of the journalism, at least in my eyes, where we can do a story. It's a baseball player is going to get drafted by the San Diego Chargers or the Padres, and we're talking to the coach, and that's enough. So.
I just think real quickly that sometimes people just don't want to get back to you, or they can't get back to you. There are times when that happens as well. And sometimes we wait if it's a story that we really do need that other side. Like the story really can't stand on its own with just one side. But sometimes also too in news, if someone does get back to us, even after, like we have several shows throughout the day, and we do, like, you just make sure that you reach out to those people, that you do your due diligence. You call them, you text them, email them, you call other people within their orbit, ask them, can you please get in touch with this person? I need to have their comment on this story, because it does in some way or in many ways involve them and their perspective on this and their fair side of this, which is very important as well. But also too, during a news cycle that, we're working on other people's time and we're working up against a deadline. So those are the big challenges. So there are times when we will say at this time of this broadcast, this person or this entity or this agency has not gotten back to us. That's not a negative thing. That just means that either they haven't had their statement pulled together yet, because very often if we're dealing with the state, it takes them a very long time to get back to us. And then we'll include that in our online stories and in our later editions of our newscast. But we always make sure to have that somehow and to let the public know that we did do our due diligence at the very least to get all sides.
This is something I wish people that we deal with from the news perspective would better understand. And I was just talking to PR professionals from the New York State Association of Counties not long ago about the way that a story is presented. And in my case, if we're talking about a 5-minute radio story, and for a good percentage of that story, we're hearing a human being with a point of view, and the other side, quote, is represented in the story, but it's just a 2-line emailed statement. By definition, the story is weighted toward the person who has taken the time to speak with us. And that's something that we really struggle with in terms of fairness, but also I'm constantly encouraging people, please do not hide behind a written statement or an emailed statement, because the story will weigh against your perspective just by the way it sounds. And I think that's a trend that I'm noticing a lot more in journalism lately, in audio journalism, is people are sometimes wary about talking to reporters. They think they're going to make a mistake. They think they're going to say something they shouldn't have said. And it's much safer to just give a written comment. But in the long run, that may hurt your credibility with the audience. And I'm constantly asking people, please get on the phone if you can spare the time.
Yeah.
Do they get back to you then when you say that?
Most of the time I would say they still don't.
Yeah, I think about editorial balance a lot. I know our New York Now team does as well. In some ways we do that, it's like, okay, we're going to do a whole show that's an interview with Governor Hochul during her campaign. Well, then we're going to do a whole show, same amount of time, with Lee Zeldin, who's running, that kind of thing. So looking big picture at balance on individual stories. If we're covering a press rally or something, I think we also trust our audiences, and we express when there is a point of view or a bias or an agenda in some way. I've been very careful about what's the editorialization of our own voice in a story. So what perspective are we sharing, and what words words really matter, and looking at things that way. And then we're constantly saying well, yes, what voice is missing here, what needs to be in this particular story, where can you take a written statement or whatever. And then also, I think one of the challenges with our show with New York Now is also the balance of power and who has power and who we value when we select a voice for a story. So, these politicians have their own sort of platforms because they're making policy and that kind of thing. And then how do we elevate the power of people who also are important? I mean, that's the other side of democracy, right? And sort of, looking at how it all works, people are an important part of that too. So it's, the whole idea of, and you don't want to create false equivalencies too with stories in terms of, balance, this one side and the other to a fault. So this is the work. This is how we think about our reputations and our integrity and how our audiences will view and value us. And we trust that our audiences understand the level of care and work that we put into it.
So how do you try to eliminate personal bias in your stories?
Sure. I think it's part of the profession, number one. I think it's part of, that's who you are. This is your job, and you have to represent. You talk about the sides of the story, what have you. You have to try and represent those as much as you possibly can. And you do that, I think, by taking in as many of these perspectives, not just with that story, but just on a daily basis. Understand what certain stakeholders, what they believe, why they believe it. If there is a certain story, why that needs to be included. So it's why, I'll watch CNN, I'll watch Fox News, I'll just see, I need to see what is going on. So that way, anything that, my family's telling me or my friends or whatever, I understand that there is a whole bunch of different people who think a lot of different things out there. So for a personal bias to come into play, you sort of have to understand what else is going on in the world around you. So whatever you personally might believe, we all have beliefs, we're humans after all, but it comes with sort of putting that aside and saying, well, inherently, I might believe this at the end of the day, whether that's from just how I was brought up or my religion or whatever, but you have to also understand what else is going on. I think it plays a lot into what we were talking about with, kind of telling different sides of the story. It's like, you have to understand that there is another voice here, there is another perspective, and you have to be able to manage that as you're looking into this process. And I think the best can remove themselves from the process. I wouldn't equate it to it, but an actor, they look at themselves as playing a character. And not that we're playing a character, but we're trying to make sure we're representing these people, not ourselves, in our work on a daily basis. That's basically what we do. We're not, many of us aren't editorializing or spreading opinions on a daily basis either.
I'll just say, I think I got into this business because I wanted to tell stories and I wanted to have a job where I could explore and reflect on the human experience. And as a public media organization, we have a mandate to serve all of our community and represent all of our community. And, thinking about what stories and what people get left out from our content, and I was looking at racial reckoning around 2020 and the questions that journalists were asking institutions. And it's like, well, are we asking those questions of ourselves? And, I think for a long time, we've done a good job of diversity on screen, that kind of thing in our work. But then what about diversity in our editorial rooms and in our organizations? And because media ultimately is also a reflection of our society at large. So I think our work is one that has to be reflective, internal, and acknowledge implicit biases, the ways that we grew up, the things that are absorbed and sometimes not spoken about, and then figure out how do we address that in the work that we do to serve everybody in the community.
One thing that I try to do with the newspaper, and I think we try to do as a group, is to sort of overcome or insulate even sort of subconscious biases, is to make sure that there's some team approach to, first of all, deciding what stories you're going to cover, and then also what the approach is going to be. I think that, you know, everybody's vulnerable to bringing their own personal ideas. And so, you know, it's a super beneficial arrangement in newsrooms that there's a vetting process just of the story selection, and then how you're going to go, and then who you're going to talk about, and then making sure that the reporting team does all the hard work to grab all those, you know, different ideas or different views of something, and reporting it so thoroughly, and then trying to write it so in such a balanced manner that you overcome any of those things, because everybody is, you know, potentially biased. But there's no doubt that particularly with newer reporters and younger ones, they need more guidance from their colleagues, whether it's another reporter or an editor, to sort of make sure that, you know, you check that bias at the door before you approach the story. Without a doubt, you know, people pitch stories to me that I have to reject, and I say, you know, I think that the premise is based on something that potentially has the appearance of some bias, so we have to take another look at it. Maybe there's a different way to get it. On the positive side, I think, you know, by and large, the media, both in the capital region and in the country, even that, you know, I know Fox News has been under a lot of fire lately with the Dominion News, and a lot of the folks in the newsroom at Fox are really good reporters who are able to do a lot of good work that is not biased at all. They've got good editors. I think, you know, the process works by and large among most of the mainstream media. I hear so frequently that the mainstream media is just totally biased and they want to, you know, bring down democracy, and I don't think it's true at all. I think that the system works pretty well. We all know that there's, you know, mistakes are made and some bad actors occasionally in any industry, just the way there are in politics and police and sports. But I think the checks and balances can eliminate the bias pretty well.
Do you ever struggle between what is the right story and the one your employer wants you to tell?
Yes, that happens a little bit, but Miles, and I can tell by how you're sort of like going through the younger and greener reporters. You obviously are a good mentor to all of them, and that's kind of what happens. There's a big group discussion about what happens. Are there ever stories that you really feel like this is the story, this is, you know, this is it, and your news director is like, I don't see it, you know? But that's part of our morning meetings and why we have these discussions. We'll kind of hash through, you know, who are the stakeholders in this? That's what we discuss a lot, you know, who are the people that this, you know, impacts? And is there any even interest in this story, and why, you know? And sometimes we can get really into the weeds in our meetings. You can go like way into a different direction, but it would be kind of interesting to kind of, I think this is great because we're kind of lifting the veil here and showing you what goes into it. There's a ton of discussion, but yeah, there are times when I've fought with my news director about some things, and you know, I'll sometimes say, you know, he lacks a little bit of the creativity, because I like sometimes going over here, you know, with the more creative, fun stuff, and he's much more conservative. But he also helps me at times. I rely on him a lot to kind of pull me back in sometimes, and so I can see like the bigger picture. So I don't know, that discussion in the morning meetings are very much about that, like why that story is the lead story of the day, or why it is.
And some of the conversations that I have with some of our younger reporters, just to kind of understand, there's a dynamic there as well between a reporter that you have that meeting and then you leave, like you're out there and you're talking to the people as well. And I think that some of the younger ones struggle. They're like, well, we talked about this, but this person's saying this and this person's saying that. And I think that there's a lot of pressure there from the person that's out in the field to kind of go back to, okay, this was but you can't force it. That's what I tell them. I say, well, make sure you're communicating what's going on out in the field, because no one's out there but you. So I think that there's a struggle sometimes with young reporters, like, well, we talked about this in the meeting and this isn't what I'm hearing. I'm like, well, you're the one that's reporting, so let's make sure that that is the focus here, and you can kind of be able to get yourself dialed back if we need to. But I think that's also another important aspect, that what happens in the meeting is necessarily what someone experiences when they're out there talking to people on a daily basis.
How much do you rely on, and I know that she touched a little bit on this, email interviews as compared to phone?
I did touch on this. I think from our perspective, it's, you get a lot of background information and heads ups, things are coming up by email. You can do some fact checking by email. But for us, it's not all that helpful to get information that we can't broadcast. So it's probably tier 2 at WAMC. And I mean, if you've listened to the station before, there's nothing that beats sound and human voices. And that's what we strive to get.
In terms of information coming from email, that's fine, but follow-up is always preferable, at least in my experience, face-to-face or on the phone. And the reason for that, 2 reasons that come to mind is, send me your questions, text me your questions, and I'll respond by email. That's going to give the person an opportunity to sit down and formalize their thoughts, but also it's going to remove the spontaneity of who they are. I'm not trying to trap you by speaking to you face to face, but what color shoes are you wearing? Do you really need to go home and talk to your people, do market surveys and find out what would be most agreeable to that. And the other part of the phone or in-person conversation is just that, it's follow-up questions. It's, I wanted to be a writer because my mother read children's books to me when I was a kid, which is great. What book were they reading? How old were you? Where did you grow up? Did they read often to you? Did your dad read to you? All of those things.
One of the challenges that I think a lot of us face, that I've spoken with other reporters that I've experienced in other states, is the reliance of email from government officials, more so than anything else, making it very difficult to get real answers to stories. And they often, you'll call their office and they'll say, okay, here's our email address, can you send us an email with some questions? And that is not just specific to our state or a certain place. This is happening in a lot of places all over the country, which is a big challenge in the journalistic process. So I don't think any of us prefer email. I would say that. I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I think at the end of the day, like, that is one of the biggest challenges we face, is their reliance on email more than anything else, whether that would be a state, city, town official. After you inquire, either by phone, showing up in person, they will defer to email a lot of the time. So then you have to go and try and catch them at an event, and that can sometimes be a whole different story. So to me, that is where one of the biggest, we talk about challenges, that is one of the toughest things, trying to ask these questions that the people and the viewers want to know from their government officials.
I'll just say, like, one, benefit of the pandemic was just the facility of using, remote interviews and, Skype and those kinds of things. And I think that's been great, actually. Like, television, similar to Ian, it's like, if it's not on, if we don't have a visual with it, if it's not, recorded, it's only going to get us so far. But we've been able to more easily get voices that we just didn't have access to broaden perspective and all of that through remote interviews, which worked great. And the reality is that nobody really cares about the video quality. I mean, yes, a real good interview looks nicer, and it's great to bring all that expensive equipment and all that stuff. As long as the audio is good, people will forgive the video. So you got to care about your audio with those remote interviews. But it's really opened up a lot of avenues for us to get additional voices to the stories.
One thing about email, and I think the pandemic has really opened up all kinds of ways of making our process easier. But one thing I know that I'm challenged with, or we challenged with, is sort of retraining a generation of newer reporters who came up through the pandemic and rely on it too much. Unfortunately, the one thing we talk about is the very best material, the really great scoop, the tip, is going to come when you bump into a public official or a baseball coach at the hardware store, or if you bump into them at the grocery store, or after the council meeting outside, standing on the sidewalk and nobody else is around. Particularly the really great, juicy stuff that we want to then pursue. People are not going to send it to you in an email because it's traceable. They're not even going to text it now. So, or even on a cell phone. I think people who have those really good nuggets, and they might be the only person who has it, they're not going to share it that way. So I see certainly with the young reporters who are willing to get out in the community and put the time in. One thing I encourage people is to, even when they're not actively covering something, to go to the street festival, see who you bump into, go to the concert at SPAC, see who you bump into, go to a hockey game at Union College. And it is amazing the doors that open, because once we have a reporter out in the field, people want to talk to us, and then the stories really come forward. So, we definitely see that the reporters that rely on email are not as productive, even close, and in terms of developing those sources. And a lot of times we get that source, or we get the tip. That's just the starting point, of course, right? And then that just blooms from there. Then you have to figure out who to talk to, which document you want to send a request under FOIL to with the local government. But if you don't get that little nugget, the tip, then your reporting is just going to be basic. And we don't want a reporter just to go to the press conference and put the mic, up. That's the starting point, and you have to do some of that. But a lot of the best community reporting comes from being out and there, getting to know the people. So,
just have another couple. One of our library patrons wanted to know about community participation, why there is such little opportunity in local media for things like letters to the editor.
Ian,
Yeah.
You guys have a lot of that.
I think this is one place that our station has done a decent job. And it's my job to pull the listener comments every week for the Friday broadcast of the listener comment line. If you want to get a little window into humanity, come and join me some week while I do that. We are a community radio station. Ultimately, even with the big broadcast area, if you listen, at 2 o'clock, people are asking about the gallbladder or the bird they saw or how to fix the tire. And we want to keep that line of communication open because it's really the lifeblood of what we're doing. I think the lowest common denominator toward that end is social media comments. And a lot of times, news stations and outlets have decided to turn off comments because they're just so nasty and antithetical to that community spirit. So it's a balance. Listeners, writing in or having letters to the editor, you want to foster honest feedback on the story. You do not want to platform neo-Nazis, and we're all trying to find the balance there. 800-323-9262 is always open.
At the Gazette, it's one thing we're really proud of. We run a lot of letters to editor. We don't run everything. We've vet them very carefully. There are 2 of us. We don't allow hate speech. We don't allow stuff that's potentially defamatory. But we've greatly actually increased the amount of letters that we have. We also invite people to write op-ed pieces or guest column pieces, and we want them to do it. What we found, if people have to take the time to craft something and submit it as a letter or a guest column, they're much more likely to be reasoned and to be sort of fair comment. The social media comments, we get those a lot. We monitor them and we hide them a lot, or we banish people from our comments because there is a lot of hate and it's not informed. We're super cautious about that, but we love to get the response. But the other thing is, I know that everybody on the panel, these news agencies, I don't, from what I see that the news agencies don't want responses. So maybe all of us have to do a better job at telling people, here's how you can converse with us. Because I think everybody on here, we want to find out what the community is thinking to help us, to inform us when we decide what to cover. Sometimes we get a letter to the editor and I'll set it aside and I'll say, we're not going to run a letter to the editor, but I'm going to assign a reporter and they're going to follow up and do a story and they'll probably talk. So.
I just want to add one thing, it is, it's interesting, just the past 3 years has been really challenging for this. And we should really be doing a better job. At least my station, I'm not speaking for everybody, but I feel like we haven't done that. We used to do MOS, Man on the Street. And actually, John McLaughlin, he did a phenomenal, he was a master of that. I'm sure many of you know him, he's now retired, but we don't do enough of that. And I would agree with you, Miles, that we have a timidity that has kind of settled in some of our newsrooms where we're a little nervous to, I'm not sure why it's happened, but I would like to see us kind of forge through that and kind of have a bit, put on our brave jackets, go out a little bit more and really ask more people, those man on the street, like, hey, what do you think of that? I even saw a brilliant way of doing it one time. There's a station, they had yet another like shooting and it was a really, really raw, horrible time for the people in that community. And it wasn't the moment to really walk up to someone on the worst day ever of their lives probably and say, hey, how do you feel? We can't do that. It's just cruel, So they actually made a small sign and they set up a camera and it said, we know this is a hard time, but if you want to share, please feel free to share. And there was a photographer manning it and he just sort of sat there and he'd turn it on. And if someone wanted to say something, they could. And I didn't see the story, but I would imagine they probably had just a boatload of incredible stories just from doing that alone. So this is a good takeaway for me. I'd like to kind of take this, I'll be taking this with me because I think that this is an important thing.
I have heard that there is something called pizza and politics or pizza and election night. Can anybody talk about that?
Let me start. I got going in sports, and every night is election night. In the games end, you're writing till 11, and then once every 2 or 4 years, it's election night, and the news staff is there waiting for the polls to close at midnight, and they always get pizza. And the sports guys are like, we're doing this every night. But it is true. And I always over order, and then you get the heartburn. And that's always our toughest night of the year, election night. A lot of times, like the last couple of elections, the big ones, the results are up in the air, and we're there 2, 3 in the morning, and the next day starts at its normal time. So it's good to have those leftovers in the fridge.
I have heard rumors pizza night on election night, and in my 20 years of working for newspapers, my election night job usually consists of covering multiple parties. We're fortunate here in Saratoga Springs because well, not last year, but they tend to be across the street from one another. And it's pretty awesome to sit in one camp and the numbers come in and they put them up and they say, and they run across the street and the numbers come in and they go, oh. And it changes. And at some point, time runs out and it's over. But back to the pizza night. So that's how I'm doing it. This is in November, and you have to dress nicely. So it's usually a thin blazer running back and forth across Broad. And okay, so I'm assuming what happens is inside of the newsroom, there are a cabal of editors waiting for your phone call. It's like, what happened is so-and-so said, we're ahead 12-1. Pizza. 20 minutes later, what happened? So-and-so said something else. Okay. The other editor, pizza. I think they have a all-night pizza.
I think, can I just add to this? I have heard about this mysterious pizza. I've never had any because I'm working election night. and the pizza goes to the station.
You got 8. Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, so it's funny. There's, I think I mentioned this earlier. There's this funny meme out there, and it's election night, and it's the people at the station, and they all have these boxes of pizza, and then there's a photographer out in the field, and he's like eating a bug like that.
Until you get back to the office at 3 in the morning and there's the empty box.
All the boxes, and you're like going through them, and you're like empty, 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 and you're like, okay.
Yes, it's probably a reminder that occasionally we need to order a salad or something. But I'm sure we're going to be having pizza on March 31st, which is, Fridays. Normally New York Now takes early in the morning, and then we're compiling the show. We run it at 7:30 at night, and then it goes statewide. And people broadcast at different times. But on March 31st, the budget, we expect the deadline to come. And our reporters already know there are going to be lots of session days, lots of late nights. And so we're going to actually record that show live to provide at least make sure that, an 8:30 a.m. Friday show is going to be dead by the evening when, maybe something happens. So, I'm sure we'll be having pizza on March 31st.
I can speak on behalf of the cabal. So we definitely order pizza every election night, and it is a big fun tradition. One thing we try to do is we try to make it earlier in the night because, like Anya said, the reporters are out during the day gathering man on the street and how did you vote? And then they come back and they have to write, and then they have to go back out to go to the polls. So we try to get a little bit of a sweet spot, and we let everybody know that maybe between 5 and 7, we're going to have pizza, and it disappears very quickly. The other part I would say is one of the things that the old cabal of editors do is we employ moderation. And so I sometimes have like a little hummus sandwich to go balance it out while I watch the young ones eat the greasy pizza. It's a lot of fun. If you look at my Twitter feed, I think since 2009, when I got on Twitter, every year on election night, I have a fun photograph of some of the reporters eating their pizza. And it's a fun place for them actually to talk stories over. The one thing about newsrooms is there's almost never a point where people are operating where they're not talking through stories. Hey, I got this guy. I talked to somebody about something. I have a quote. Do you want it for your story because it doesn't fit in mine? Or they're just coming up with strategies about how they're going to tell their story that day. So it's, I think there's a benefit to it around the pizza boxes to especially on election night, which is, and then we actually have one guy who our longtime sports columnist who every year reminds us, this is like Friday night in the sports department.
Well, and I'll just say, look at the thoughtful editorial balance of, not listing any brands. Since I know that's a loaded political.
I want to thank you very much for coming out today. Do you have anything that you would like to say before we go?
Subscribe. Watch and listen. I consume everybody's stuff here. It's a great region to be in. All the stations do great papers. It's just a really good, rich place. And I've been in, I've visited other places where there's just nothing. It's terrifying what's going to happen to, because that's, studies have shown that's when corruption happens and communities suffer and school boards don't operate efficiently and kids' scores suffer. So.
But one last thing, please be kind to those new reporters too, and give them your support and let them know, like, if you see something in your community, maybe reach out to them. We're always looking for stories. We're always looking for ideas. We can't always promise coverage, but we love to hear from everyone. We love to hear from you. And if you see a reporter out on the street, just talk to them and let them know, like, what's going on in your community, because it comes back.
Yeah, I would just say, we get what we pay for, and the more robust the local journalism is, the better the community is, and the more people who are watching the store. I don't think any of us takes it for granted. These jobs are not as plentiful as they used to be. They're tough. Our cohort in Western Massachusetts yesterday announced 20% layoffs. That's not something we want to see in the capital region, because that's just fewer people there to keep an eye on things. And, my experience in radio has been that it's a very ephemeral thing, and it's a weird experience to go into a soundproof room, record yourself, and put it out into the world, and not really know how it's being received. So doing things like this is just great to get the reinforcement that, once we were putting it out there, that people are there, hopefully listening or clicking on it. So thank you all.
Wanted to thank you for having us, and also thank you for the resources you provide. I will say, when I did first move here and realized I'd be staying for a while and writing about the community, I had to learn about the history of the community, and that involved historians and residents and so forth. But one of the most valuable resources is one floor up in the Saratoga room, where a collection of newspapers, articles, stories, pictures, city directories, which tell you actual addresses of what was here before what is here, and what was here before what was here before. And oral histories conducted by residents from the early 1900s. Someone just went around and said, "What are you doing today?" "Oh, I'm going to the market and bought 15 tomatoes for 4 cents, to give you a slice of life." So thank you for the Saratoga room. That wonderful.
All right, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.